We have participants from almost all time zones. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And thank you very much for participating. On behalf of the International Pollutants Elimination Network and our co-sponsors, Casa from Mexico, Cefed from Nepal, and the EcoWaste Coalition from the Philippines, I warmly welcome you to this global webinar on catalyzing the global phase-out of lead paints. I'm glad to inform you that we have 151 registered participants from 39 countries across the globe. This event is part and parcel of the civil society's contributions to the ongoing International Lead Poisoning Prevention Program. I am Manik Alonso, past co-chair of IPEN and advisor to the IPEN Global Lead Paint Elimination Campaign. I am joining you from the Philippines. Co-facilitating this webinar with me is Dr. Sarah Brochet, IPEN Science Advisor and Global Lead Paint Elimination Campaign Manager. Sarah, who is based in Gothenburg, Sweden, also represents IPEN at the Advisory Council of the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. Before we proceed, please allow me to reiterate the following reminders. This webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made public on IPEN's YouTube channel. Language interpretations for Arabic, Indonesia, Chinese, French, Russian, and Spanish are available. You may click on the interpretation button down below and choose the language of your choice. We'll allow 1 or 2 questions after each presentation. There will be a longer Q&A towards the end of the webinar. You may type your question using the Q&A button below. And lastly, we would like to invite you all to complete the post-webinar survey later. Last month, the successful completion of a global effort to rid the world of lead in petrol was announced. This effort was initiated at the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002, a meeting that also agreed to support the phase-out of lead in lead-based paints. In 2009, more than 100 governments participating in the International Conference on Chemicals Management recognized that lead paint is a serious issue of concern, especially for populations in developing countries, and committed to promote phasing out the use of lead in paints through a partnership called the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint. This commitment was reaffirmed in 2012 and 2015. The initial target was to phase out lead by 2020, but this was not achieved. To date, only 43% of the countries in the world have confirmed legally binding controls on lead paint. Little is known about the enforcement of many of these regulations. Also, international trade of lead pigments and lead paints continues unhampered. Therefore, while the global phase-out of leaded automotive fuels is complete, much more still needs to be done to achieve the global phase-out of lead paints. In response to this challenge, IPEN is launching a global campaign to get Rotterdam Convention listings of the lead pigments that are used as paint ingredients. This webinar will discuss how listing lead pigments will advance global lead paint elimination, help countries adopt and enforce lead paint control regulations, and make exporting countries assume major responsibilities for the control of lead pigments and the lead paints that contain them. To provide us with an overview of the global efforts to eliminate lead paint, particularly the progress and successes so far and the challenges that we face to make lead paint history, is Jeiel Guarino, a chemist and IPEN's Global Lead Paint Elimination Campaigner. Jeiel works with IPEN member groups in over 50 countries. assisting them in conducting lead paint studies, in developing regulations, and in raising stakeholders' awareness about lead paint and the need for strong health protective lead paint laws. He has experience working with paint manufacturers, including small and medium-sized enterprises, with paint industry associations, and with suppliers of alternatives to lead in their work to transition to non-lead paint production. Jeiel hails from the Philippines and is one of the pillars of our own campaign to phase out lead in all paint categories. The floor is yours, Jeiel.
Hello, everyone. I am Jeiel Guarino, Global Lead Paint Elimination Campaigner from the International Pollutants Elimination Network, or IPEN, a global network of over 600 non-governmental organizations working in more than 120 countries to reduce and eliminate the harm to human health and environment from toxic chemicals such as lead. Today, I will share with you an overview of IPEN's global efforts to eliminate lead paint. This includes 1. A brief background and timeline of IPEN's global campaign. 2. The components of our work on the ground and campaigns at the national level. 3. The key strategies that have made our campaigns successful. 4. The campaign progress and achievements and international recognitions that our campaigns received. And 5. The challenges that our campaigns continually face as we move forward. IPEN's global campaign to eliminate lead paint was launched in 2008 after NGOs in the IPEN network began to research the lead content of paints in the developing world. The results were alarming. In 11 low and middle income countries in Africa, Asia, Eastern Europe, and Latin America, most of the solvent-based decorative paints purchased and analyzed by IPEN NGOs contained extremely high levels of lead, as high as 500,000 parts per million. In response to IPEN studies and other activities, the second session of the International Conference on Chemicals Management, or ICCM2, held in Geneva, Switzerland in 2009, passed a resolution identifying lead in paint as an emerging policy issue, endorsed a global partnership to promote phasing out the use of lead in paints, and invited the United Nations Environment Programme and the World Health Organization to serve as the secretariat for this global partnership called the Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint, or GAELP. GAELP has set a target date of 2020 for all countries having adopted legally binding laws, regulations, standards, and/or procedures to control the production, import, sale, export, distribution, and use of lead paints. From 2012 up to today, IPEN, in cooperation with international partners led by UNEP and WHO, and national partners from governments, industry, and civil society, has implemented projects to address this issue, starting with the European Union-funded Switch Asia project in 7 countries from 2012 until 2015, the Global Environment Facility, or GEF-funded Africa project in 15 countries from 2014 until 2017, as well as the ongoing GEF-funded SciChem project, which provided assistance to over 60 countries, in which IPEN takes the implementation lead in about 10 of these countries. In the next slide, I will discuss the components of our campaigns at the country level, with a focus on the problem of lead paint as the world's most widespread source of childhood lead exposure. The aims of the campaign include: 1. To establish effective health protective regulations on lead in all paints, adopted and enforced at the national level to eliminate the manufacture, sale, and import of lead paint. And 2. to eliminate the trade of lead pigments and lead dryers. The key stakeholders of the campaign include policymakers, paint industry leaders, including paint manufacturers and suppliers of raw materials, consumers, health professionals, and the children, the most vulnerable group to lead poisoning. In the next two slides, I will be discussing the key strategies that we have employed in our campaigns. First is data generation. Research studies such as lead in paint, lead in playground equipment, lead in toys, lead in other consumer products, blood lead levels in children and paint workers provide justification for stakeholders to act. Second, public information is key to raising awareness on lead paint, and quad media, including print, TV, radio, and online media, help publicize the problem and elevate the issue of lead paint elimination at the national level. Third, a multi-stakeholder approach is a good model of working with governments, industry, and civil society, and building alliances and relationships among stakeholders ensure broad support in the development of health protective regulations versus lead paint. Fourth, the deliberate focus on the adverse and the lifelong impacts of childhood lead exposure from lead paint and putting children's health at the center of our campaign messaging resonate well with stakeholders, enabling them to take immediate actions to eliminate lead paint. Fifth, collaborative relationship with paint manufacturers, paint industry associations, and supply chain vendors is instrumental in eliminating business resistance to our advocacy, allows progressive industry leaders become champions for the cause, and helps motivate manufacturers, especially small and medium-sized manufacturers or SMEs, in undertaking reformulation efforts. Sixth, the promotion of third-party lead-safe paint certification allows paint manufacturers to show its compliance with 90 ppm legal limits established in some countries. And it also provides consumers with necessary information to make informed purchasing decisions and minimize unnecessary exposures to lead paint. In the next two slides, I will be sharing with you the progress and achievements that we have made in the past 13 years. Today, there are ongoing national campaigns in 32 countries in 8 IPEN regions. Since 2008, IPEN NGOs purchased and analyzed over 3,800 paints for lead content in over 50 countries. Study results would show that lead paints are still sold in many low and middle income countries. New or strengthened regulations have been adopted in more than 30 countries, and over 20 countries are currently engaged in finalizing lead paint controls. The Global Alliance to Eliminate Lead Paint has become effective and key actor in promoting and coordinating global lead paint elimination efforts. IPEN sits at Jeiel's Advisory Council, and over 30 IPEN NGOs and 5 allied paint manufacturers and industries have become registered partners of Jeiel. Established in 2016, the world's first third-party lead-safe paint certification program for paints without added lead has expanded to 3 countries, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh. As of today, at least 17 brands from 5 paint manufacturers were certified lead-safe under the program. These comprise 90% of the decorative paint market in the Philippines, including the 2 largest paint manufacturers and 1 SME, as well as leading local manufacturers in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. In addition, some industrial paint brands were also certified under the program. In the next 2 slides, I will be sharing with you some of the international recognitions the campaign in the Philippines has received. In 2018, Manny Calonzo, former IPEN co-chair and current IPEN advisor on global lead paint elimination, received the Goldman Environmental Prize for his contributions in spearheading an advocacy campaign that persuaded the Philippine government to enact a national ban on the production, import, and sale of lead paint in 2013, which at the time was the world's most health protective lead paint regulation, setting a 90 ppm total lead limit in all types of paints, including industrial paints. In July this year, the aforementioned regulation, also known as the Chemical Control Order or CCO, for lead and lead compounds, promulgated by the government of the Philippines through its Department of Environment and Natural Resources, DNR, banning lead in the manufacture of paints to prevent children's and workers' lead exposure, was adjudged one of the 5 winners of the 2021 Future Policy Award, also known as the Oscar on Best Policies. With the CCO, the Philippines became the first Southeast Asian country to successfully implement comprehensive legislation banning the use of lead additives in all paints. In 2020, the Philippine Association of Paint Manufacturers, PAPM, whose manufacturer members comprise over 95% of the Philippine paint market, announced that they had beaten the phase-out deadline for lead paints, as the industry no longer imports lead additives used in the manufacture of paints in the Philippines. In the last 2 slides, I will discuss the challenges that our campaigns have encountered through the years. First, lead paint elimination campaigns are conducted country by country, and while IPEN NGOs greatly help in raising public awareness, reaching out to the paint industry sector and key stakeholders, and supporting government agencies in the process of developing regulations, there are a lot more countries in the world, and going one at a time takes a long time. Second, majority of the countries today, or 57%, still do not have legally binding laws. And even in some countries that have enacted laws, lead limits are not health protective and need to be improved or revised. Third, monitoring and enforcement of existing lead paint regulations is lacking. This is supported by our research studies that show lead paint remains available for sale in retail stores and online shops in many countries that have enacted laws. Fourth, voluntary reformulation efforts by the paint industry needs to be scaled up. SMEs, which have limited resources and technical capacity, need the most help. Fifth, the worldwide trade of lead pigments and other lead additives used in the production of paint need to be controlled so that its availability to manufacturers, especially to SMEs, is diminished. All these challenges highlight the importance of listing under the Rotterdam Convention lead pigments commonly used in the manufacture of paints, as well as lead paint that contains them. This is the end of my presentation, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jeiel, for providing us with the context to IPEN's latest initiative to take the global campaign to eliminate lead paint to the next level, which we will be discussing further in a while. Sarah?
Thank you very much, Jeiel, and thank you, Manny. I will be handing out questions that you post in the Q&A chat to our presenters. And we will take a few questions between each presentation, but there will also be time at the end of this webinar or towards the end of the webinar for more questions. So if you forgot to ask something right now, there will be more time. But please post those questions in the Q&A chat, as you can see at the bottom of the Zoom webinar screen. And I know it takes a little bit of time to type your questions, so we will give everyone a minute or two to type your question, and we will see what interesting topics come up. And while you're doing that, I also would like to take the opportunity to welcome everyone and see how happy I am to see so many new and old friends from so many countries. It is very exciting. And I don't see any questions yet, so I'm gonna also just take the opportunity. Jeiel has been a lead paint elimination campaigner for a number of years now. So Jeiel, what is the most, what do you see has changed the most from when you started until now? You don't have to elaborate on all of the things, but is there anything that you can think of that really stands out to you that's very different compared to then?
Thank you, Sarah, for the question, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Since I was part of the regional campaign in the Philippines in 2012, I have seen that more and more people become aware of the issue of lead paint and lead poisoning, as well as its importance to be eliminated. And especially when we talk to stakeholders from the government, the industry, and even from the academe and the consumer sectors, we see that more and more people are interested about the topic and try to do their best to raise awareness as well. And from 9 years ago until now, I think the awareness that we have created has allowed more and more champions from different countries, different regions to step up and be heard, and themselves have been pillars of the campaign in their own countries. And while working with our network of NGOs in over 120 countries, we're able to see that more and more people become in tune to the advocacy. And if we see more barriers in the past, right now, at least we see that more people agree that we have to eliminate lead in paints.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to give you one more question that came in through the Q&A chat. Which are, in your view, the most critical elements or success factors that are key to effectively regulate lead in paint?
Thank you for the question, Ingrid. I think when I said about awareness raising, it is also important to make our legislators or authorities in position become aware, because they're the first hand, they're the first, the frontliners in terms of putting up these regulations. And if they are not aware of the issue, and if they feel that these problems do not exist in their countries, they will not act. So when they are informed about the issue, and they feel that the issue affects them, their families, and their children, they become easier to talk to. They become more encouraged to do steps, actions to eliminate lead paint in their countries.
Thank you, Jeiel. And I will give the floor back to Manny to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Ingrid, for your question. Ingrid is from the World Future Council. Thanks also, Jeiel, for your reply. Our next resource person is from Guadalajara, Mexico. Sofia Chavez is founder and director general of Casa, a non-government organization that seeks to contribute to the improvement of the socio-environmental conditions in the western region of Mexico. With Sofia at the helm, Casa undertakes a variety of programs in relation to the life cycle of natural resources and their interaction with humans. It has carried out projects addressing municipal waste, electronic waste, and lead in paint, to name a few. Sofia and her team released a report on the lead content of decorative paints sold for home use in Mexico in 2018, which showed that 55% of the 118 analyzed paints had lead concentrations above 90 ppm. In that study, they also found a yellow paint labeled as lead-free with 130,000 ppm lead. In 2019, Casa analyzed playground equipment for lead content and found 25% of the analyzed equipment had lead levels above 100,000 ppm. To tell us more about the situation in Mexico and the benefits of listing lead pigments in Rotterdam Convention, let's welcome and listen to Sofia.
Thank you. My name is Sofia Chavez. I am the General Director of Casa in Mexico, and I am going to talk a little about the Mexican situation pertaining to lead in paint and the benefits from having leaded pigments listed under the Rotterdam Prior Informed Consent procedure. We are a Mexican NGO, and we have been an IPEN member since 2016. And since 2018, we have been working alongside with IPEN towards the elimination of lead in paint in Mexico. So where are we as pertains to lead content in paint? The first lead in paint study performed in the country took place in 2009. And in that study, there were only 20 samples analyzed. And what was found in that study was that 100% of the paints analyzed were above 90 parts per million of lead. And the highest lead content was 163,000 parts per million. We performed a second study in 2018, and in that second study, there were 118 samples analyzed. And in those samples, we found that 55% of them were under 90 ppm, and the rest of them were over 90 ppm. We even found 12% of them over 10,000 ppm. However, we still found big amounts of lead in some samples, and the highest number was 200,000 parts per million. How did we perform this study? The paint samples were analyzed through acid digestion, followed by a flame atomic absorption spectrometry. The samples were exported to be tested in the US. Now, where are we as legislation, as far as legislation goes? We have a current national legislation which does not limit lead content in any type of paint. This legislation was published in 2008. And it says that the limit set for lead content is 600 ppm, but this limit is only set for labeling purposes. That means that if a paint has over 600 parts per million, then it's supposed to be labeled as such. You can see here, there's a container, a paint container, which says contains lead compounds, solvents, and toxic substances, which by contact, prolonged or repeated inhalation cause serious health damage. There have been some efforts to change the legislation. However, these have not been adopted yet. There's a draft legislation, which is the draft standard Proinom 003 SSA1, which was printed as a draft in 2018. But however, it has not been adopted yet. There have been some technical matters that have caused this delay. There has been another effort, a more recent effort, to limit the content of lead in paint in the country. And this is an initiative to modify an article of the General Health Law And this initiative came through a senator. This was presented for discussion on August 5th of 2020, but it hasn't been discussed yet. It's been pending since then. In any case, both draft legislations have important loopholes, as they only talk about limiting lead content in solvent-based domestic and decorative paint, and they do not limit lead content in traffic or industrial paint, printing ink, or enamel. We also have a problem with the lack of capacity for surveillance and enforcement. In the study performed in 2018, we found that there were a number of paints which were over 90 parts per million, but the container did not have a label which said so. So we found that there were containers that did not say that there was lead content inside, which did have lead, and the other way around too. One more thing that we're lacking is certified laboratories for testing lead content in paint. Even in one of the drafted proposals to limit the lead content in the Appendix B, it says that when analytical results are lacking, lead content can be calculated according to the theoretical method based on the formulation. And even first-party supplier declarations are accepted. We also have illegal and unbranded leaded paints imports and sales. We have found in the marketplace bulk sales providing no information on content, origin, or manufacturer. So we do find some benefits of the Rotterdam prior informed consent listing pertaining pigments which contain lead. We think that this would force governments to take a stand on this issue in the international arena. And a listing would shift the enforcement to customs officials. It would also accelerate the adoption of a national legislation to limit lead content in paints. It would force a phase out of locally manufactured lead-containing pigments and paints. It would cover for national legislation loopholes, as it could list all possible leaded pigments used for paints, varnishes, lacquers, stains, enamels, glazes, primers, inks, and coatings used for any purpose. This would also open the market for lead-free alternatives and prevent leftover leaded pigments or paint stocks to be transferred to countries with weaker regulations or surveillance. This would also provide a level playing field for all manufacturers. However, we do have some challenges. The industrial paint manufacturers have mentioned cost increases and less chemical and weather resistance in the use of lead-free pigments. So we need to turn that around. Industry members, and especially industrial paint manufacturers, would need to make a major effort to reformulate their products. They have mentioned a 1 or 2 year transition period would be advisable. Small and medium-sized companies will need extensive technical assistance to reformulate. And we need to make sure that a level playing field is enforced. We should work on this very hard for the sake of our children. Well, thank you very much. My name is Sofia Chavez again, and you can see here my email if you have any comments or if you want to ask some questions. And now I pass the microphone back to our organizers.
Thank you, Sofia, for sharing your experience at the country level and the many benefits if lead pigments are listed under Annex 3 of the Rotterdam Convention. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Sofia, for your interesting presentation. We have questions coming in through the Q&A chat. Please continue to post questions and I will hand them out to our speakers as we go along. So Sofia, we have a question here. Based on your experiences in Mexico, what do you think is standing in the way of the efforts to eliminate lead paints in many countries?
Well, I think I have like 3 levels to answer that question. One of them is legislation, but the other one is a surveillance, and the third one is enforcement. We should work on the 3 of them because what we have seen is that even if we have legislation, nobody's looking or making sure it is enforced. And I think that's the best, the worst thing, to have a legislation and not having it enforced. I think we should work very hard on the 3 levels. That would be my answer.
Thank you. I also have a slightly different question. You have worked a lot very constructively with the paint industry in Mexico in the same way as many NGOs have done in their countries. Is there any specific lessons learned that you can share that you have thought about throughout this year, considering that the paint industry is an important stakeholder for any Rotterdam Convention listing?
Yes, it's been a real pleasure for me to be able to work along the industry in Mexico. I think that working together helps to direct many more efforts into eliminating lead in paint. In fact, we met for the first time after we published our first report in 2018. They came to our office and we had a very pleasant meeting. And from then on, we've been working together. So I think that working along the industry has been very helpful for both sides because we're pushing towards the same direction. And I would advise that every country that goes into this process really to work together with the paint industry. We've been working very close and talking a lot and making efforts to have this work for Mexico.
Thank you very much. I think that's it for now. So I'm going to hand it back over to Manny.
Muchas gracias, Sofia. I will now introduce our last speaker. Last but certainly not least, Jack Weinberg, our next resource person, is a past co-chair of IPEN, a senior policy advisor to IPEN, and a member of IPEN lead paint elimination team. He organized IPEN's founding meeting in 1998, and he has been working with IPEN since then. Jack has been a campaigner and activist since the early 1960s and has worked on issues of civil rights, students' rights, workers' rights, anti-war, social justice, and the environment. Jack has been an international campaigner on issues relating to toxic pollutants and environmental health since 1990. He was the civil society representative on the Intergovernmental Committee that developed the proposal for governments to negotiate what became the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, or POPs. Jack's 2-part presentation will focus on how a Rotterdam Convention listing of lead pigments can accelerate global phase-out of lead paints. Without more ado, let's hear from my mentor and idol, Jack, who is based in Chicago, USA.
Thank you for that introduction, Manny, and thanks to everybody for turning out. My job today is to tell you about the new campaign that IPEN is launching to get the Rotterdam Convention to list the lead pigments that are commonly used as ingredients in paints. My presentation will be in two parts. The first part is about the Rotterdam Convention, about its prior informed consent procedure, and about what will happen if the convention decides to list the lead pigments. There'll be a question and answer period, and then the second part will be about how the Rotterdam Convention listing can greatly accelerate the global elimination of all lead paints. There's not time today for my presentation to cover all the important technical details, to talk about campaign strategies, campaign plans, or about what interested IPEN POs can do in your countries to help advance this campaign. But rest assured, this is not the last that you'll hear from us. Part 1, the Rotterdam Convention. The Rotterdam Convention is a legally binding international treaty with 164 country parties. The convention implements a prior informed consent procedure for certain hazardous chemicals. Countries can use this PIC procedure to prevent imports of the listed hazardous chemicals under conditions that they specify. Exporters must receive consent from the importing country before they can send it any listed hazardous chemical. The process for listing a chemical begins when at least one country from each of at least two regions notify the convention secretary that has taken regulatory action to ban or severely restrict a hazardous chemical because it is harmful to human health and or the environment. Numerous countries have adopted strict regulatory controls on the lead content of paints. These regulatory actions impose severe restrictions on the use of lead pigments commonly used as paint ingredients. Therefore, those countries that have adopted strict regulatory controls on the lead content of paints can submit notifications to the Rotterdam Secretariat that describe how and why their lead paint regulations impose a severe restriction on those lead pigments that are commonly used as paint ingredients. And if these notifications are properly prepared, they should fully satisfy all the convention's requirements and all its criteria for the listing of lead pigments in Annex 3. Once lead pigments are listed, it should be possible to apply the PIC procedure not only to the lead pigments themselves, but also to the lead pigments when they are contained as intentional ingredients in paints. The convention defines the term chemical to mean, quote, a substance, whether by itself or in a mixture. Paints are mixtures that contain pigments as essential ingredients. So, if a lead pigments are listed in Annex 3, the provisions of the convention can be applied not only to imports of the listed lead pigments as pure chemicals, the provisions can also be applied to lead pigments when they are present as ingredients in imported paints, which are mixtures. Countries will then have the right to deny import consent to the lead pigments, whether as chemicals themselves or to the lead pigments when present as intentional ingredients in paints. And every exporting country will be obligated to prevent companies within its jurisdiction from exporting the listed lead pigments and paints that contain them as intentional ingredients without first receiving the consent of the government of the importing country. As soon as the lead pigments are listed, the convention will ask the World Customs Organization to assign a specific harmonized system custom code to the listed lead pigments. Then, every exporting country must require that exporters within its jurisdiction put this custom code on the shipping documents when they export a listed lead pigment by itself or when it's present in a paint as an intentional ingredient. Customs officers in importing countries can then easily identify shipments of listed lead pigments and shipments of paints that contain them as intentional ingredients. When the lead pigments are listed, the convention will notify this to all its party countries, and they will be expected to respond to the listing decision within 9 months. They can respond in one of 4 possible ways. The party can consent to no future imports of the listed lead pigments. The party can consent to all future imports of the listed lead pigments. The party can consent to future imports of the listed lead pigments only if some specified conditions are met, or the party can state that it needs more time to decide. If a country has already adopted national lead paint controls, it can then consent to imports of the listed lead pigments only if the imports are consistent with the controls that it has already adopted, and this gives it a means of helping enforce its regulations. A party that has not yet adopted national lead paint controls can use the process by which it develops its formal response as an opportunity and also as a framework for considering and adopting national lead paint regulatory controls. Parties have both rights and obligations under the Rotterdam Convention. Every party that exports listed pigments and/or exports paints that contain them as intentional ingredients must require that companies within its jurisdiction export those products to the responding party only if that party's specified conditions are met. Exporting parties must prohibit the unconsented export of listed lead pigments for use in the manufacture of paints, all paints or just some kinds of paints, paints that contain the listed lead pigment as intentional ingredients. Again, all paints or just some kinds of paints. But the convention also imposes obligation on importing countries. A party is not allowed under international law to permit the domestic manufacture for domestic use of any product for which it is denied import consent under the Rotterdam PIC procedure. A party that denies import consent to lead pigments for use in the manufacture of all or some kinds of paints must not permit the domestic manufacture of lead pigments for this use. A party that denies consent to imports of all or some paints that contain the listed lead pigments as ingredients must not permit the domestic manufacture of such paints. To summarize, if lead pigments are listed, every party will have the right to use the PIC procedure to impose obligations on exporting parties. They do this by specifying the conditions under which they deny consent to imports of the listed lead pigments and to imports of the paints that contain them as intentional ingredients. However, a party that uses the PIC procedure in this way becomes obligated under international law to impose corresponding prohibitions on the domestic manufacture of the listed pigments and the domestic manufacture of paints that contain them as intentional ingredients.
Thank you very much, Jack, for the first half of the presentation. We're taking we're splitting the presentation up in 2 to give you time to absorb this information. This is a new initiative that IPEN is embarking on. So there's a lot of new terms. There's a lot of new information here. So please, we have a couple of minutes for some clarifying questions or some general question about this first half. But we will also have a longer time for Q&A after the second half of the presentation. I don't see any specific questions in the Q&A chat right away, so please keep on adding them. We are only taking questions right now in the chat, so please write away and we'll direct them towards Jack or whomever else will be the relevant person. We have questions coming in. And we will start with a question. This is to you, Jack. Do you think you have to get the single pigments listed in Annex 3?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Do you think you have to get the single pigments listed in Annex 3?
Okay, I think I understand. You have to list pigments by name when you send a notification. We're not naming them at this point because we want to do a survey of all the pigments that are commonly used as ingredients in paints. And then we would encourage countries to then submit notifications stating that their lead paint regulatory controls impose severe restrictions on those pigments. So yes, they will be eventually be listed by name, but at this point, we are just speaking generally. But all the lead pigments commonly used as ingredients in paints should be listed.
And I have a follow-up question here. That is, what would be the proposal to list paints, lead paints, under the Rotterdam Convention?
Paints themselves would not be listed, but if lead pigments are listed, then if they are contained in paints as intentional ingredients, that will be one way of importing lead pigments. Similarly, for example, if you take the pesticide parathion, it may be contained in a pesticide formulation, only 5% or 7% parathion in a pesticide formulation. So parathion, the chemical, is listed, but the mixture that contains it, the formulation, is also subject to the PIC procedure. Similarly with lead paints, if the pigments are listed, then mixtures that contain the pigments as intentional ingredients would also be covered because you would be importing the pigments within mixtures.
Thank you very much, Jack. We have more questions, but I'll save them for later because I do think they relate to your second part of the presentation. And we will, of course, as I mentioned, have more time for Q&A later. So please keep the questions coming.
Part 2, how a Rotterdam Convention decision to list lead pigments can greatly accelerate global lead paint elimination. Some of the countries that have adopted lead paint regulatory controls are having difficulty achieving full compliance. One of the reasons is that imported lead pigments are often easily available for unrestricted purchase, and some paint manufacturers decide it's just easier to purchase and use them as ingredients in their paints, even though it is prohibited by national law to do so. Another problem is that some lead paints continue to be illegally imported, sold, and used. A Rotterdam Convention listing of lead pigments will make it much easier for governments and for civil society to track and stop imports of lead pigments that are destined for prohibited uses and imports of prohibited lead paint. Even so, some imports of unconsented lead pigments and of unconsented lead paints may continue for a time. But because these will be illegal imports, they will become increasingly risky, costly, and unreliable. Over time, such illegal imports will become too costly and too troublesome to be worth the bother. A Rotterdam listing will also help remove some of the barriers that have prevented many countries from so far adopting national regulatory controls on lead paints. In 2002, the Johannesburg World Summit on Sustainable Development called for the phase out of lead paints. In 2009, the International Conference on Chemicals Management asked UNEP and WHO to establish a global partnership to promote phasing out lead paints. The United Nations Environmental Assembly, the World Health Organization, both have called upon governments to establish national controls on lead paints, but most governments have still not imposed regulatory controls on lead paints. Why then hasn't there been more progress? Authoritative international bodies and medical professionals have called upon all governments to adopt national lead paint controls. It's widely known that exposure to lead from paints is harmful to children's health and reduces their mental capabilities. Alternatives to lead paint are available and affordable. There must, therefore, be barriers that are preventing many governments from taking regulatory action to control lead paints. We'll discuss here two of the barriers that appear to have prevented many governments from adopting regulatory controls on lead paint, and we'll also discuss how a Rotterdam listing can help to remove those barriers. The first barrier is that many governments have weak regulatory infrastructure, and those infrastructures are already overburdened. Officials are often reluctant to adopt new regulatory controls when they lack the resources and capabilities needed to adequately enforce the regulations that are already on their books. The second barrier is a lack of urgency. High-level government officials face many urgent issues, often making it difficult for them to focus attention on issues like lead paint that do not appear to be time sensitive. The government officials that have frontline responsibility for enforcing environmental health regulatory controls are often highly overburdened. Overburdened officials tend to lack enthusiasm for adopting additional regulations, especially when they lack the resources and authority needed to enforce the controls already on the books. And in many countries, this lack of enthusiasm by frontline environmental health officials is a barrier to the adoption of national lead paint regulatory controls. If the Rotterdam Convention lists lead pigment, the PIC procedure will make it much easier for many countries to effectively enforce national lead paint regulatory controls. In many countries, many or most of the paints available for sale in the national market are imported. Additionally, domestic paint manufacturers usually import all or most of the pigments they use as ingredients in the manufacture of paints. Once lead pigments are listed, the Rotterdam PIC procedure will place responsibility in the first instance for preventing unwanted imports of lead pigments and of lead paints that contain them on the governments of the exporting countries. National customs officials will assume much of the responsibility for domestic enforcement. Enforcement of lead paint regulatory controls will no longer be the sole responsibility of environmental health enforcement officials, and these officials then may become much more open, enthusiastic, and willing to support the adoption of national lead paint regulatory controls. In many countries, however, the greatest barrier to securing national lead paint controls appears to be the difficulties in getting the attention of those high-level government officials who are the only ones with the authority to initiate the regulatory process. But when the Rotterdam Convention lists lead pigments, and every country is expected to craft a formal response within 9 months, then this process must begin at the high political level. A party's response to a Rotterdam listing may impose legal obligations on the government that submits it. The response, therefore, will need to be reviewed and formally approved at an appropriately high political level before it can be submitted. In those countries that have not yet adopted lead paint regulatory controls, the need to prepare and approve the country's response to the listing decision will place the question of lead paints and lead pigments squarely on the desk of government officials with high-level decision-making authority. High-level officials will need to consider whether their country should accept imports of lead pigments and of paints that contain them. Those high-level officials who previously were able to avoid dealing with this question will now have time pressure under which they will have to consider what to do about lead paint. Many of the governments that were previously unready to adopt regulatory controls on lead paints may now be also unwilling to consent to all imports of the listed lead pigments out of concern that doing this might signal that they approve lead paints and approve their continuing use. In these cases, governments may use this as an opportunity to initiate internal reviews, consultations, and investigation. And once this process starts, it is likely that many will decide to enact regulatory controls and begin their process by denying consent to imports of the listed lead pigments under conditions that they specify. And when this happens, the Rotterdam Convention's PIC procedure can become both the opportunity and a framework within which parties can enact serviceable national lead paint regulatory controls. As was explained earlier, parties will have the right, subject to conditions that they specify, to prevent imports of the listed lead pigments for use as ingredients in the domestic manufacture of paints, and if they are present as intentional ingredients in paints. But when they do this, they will become obligated, subject to the same specified conditions, to prohibit the domestic manufacture of the listed lead pigments and the domestic manufacture of paints that contain them as intentional ingredients. Many governments have expedited decision-making procedures that they can use when they are obligated to enact regulatory controls by an international convention. A party that decides to use the PIC procedure to prevent imports of illicit lead pigments under specified conditions becomes obligated to simultaneously prohibit, subject to the same conditions, the domestic manufacture of the listed lead pigments and paints that contain them. In many cases, the party will be able to use an expedited decision-making procedure to fulfill this obligation. Many countries will be able to enact serviceable national regulatory controls on lead paints, 1, by using the Rotterdam PIC procedure to prevent imports of the listed lead pigments and paints that contain them as ingredients subject to conditions that the party specifies, and 2, by simultaneously using an expedited decision-making procedure for the party to meet its corresponding domestic obligations. For many parties to the convention, a Rotterdam Convention listing will enable them to use their formal response as an opportunity and as a framework for enacting national lead paint regulatory controls. To summarize my entire presentation, 1. Many countries have severely restricted the use of lead pigments by adopting strict national lead paint control regulations. 2. IPEN is confident that these regulatory actions qualify as the basis for submitting valid country notifications that nominate the severely restricted lead pigments for listing by the convention. 3. Once lead pigments are listed, the PIC procedure will provide assistance and encouragement to countries that are currently facing challenges in enforcing and/or in adopting national lead paint controls. 4. Therefore, in this and other ways, a Rotterdam listing listing can help greatly accelerate our shared global lead paint elimination goal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack. We have questions coming in through the Q&A chat function. Again, if you haven't seen it, it's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Please keep the questions coming. We see many very good questions and interesting questions. So please just keep them coming. And I'll give a few more to Jack right now, and we will have more time later. So Jack, this is in relation, I believe, to you talked about of government officials are feeling overburdened. But will this disappear, or won't, if their pigments are listed under the Rotterdam Convention, won't that just contribute to them feeling more overburdened, or will it help them?
No, it'll definitely help them. I mean, the people I'm talking about feeling overburdened are the frontline people in the Environmental Health Agency, which have the responsibility all themselves, and they can't do much about it. Now the responsibility is broadened out. Exporting countries have responsibilities, customs officials have responsibilities, and the environmental health frontline officials only have to sort of overview the whole thing. So it's a much lesser problem for them.
Thank you very much for that answer. And one of our strategic colleagues have already started to thinking about the next steps here. And he is wondering if you see any industry sector that could oppose the listing of lead pigments in the Rotterdam Convention.
I suspect that those who will oppose it will be the lead industry and those companies still producing, the big companies still producing leaded industrial paints. But I doubt whether they'll do it openly and publicly. It will probably be whisper campaigns and behind the scenes and working through third parties. I doubt whether many will openly and publicly oppose it.
I think for the last question for this Q&A session, I will pick this important question, and that is, how can NGOs get involved in this? How can NGOs contribute to the success of this campaign?
We will be more in touch with you, but the first step will be to work with your industry and with your government officials to encourage them to develop and submit notifications. There are certain technical issues involved in developing these notifications, but IPEN will be very happy to help mobilize the intellectual resources to assist governments in doing so.
Thank you very much, Jack. I will leave the floor to Manny again.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Sarah. Before we proceed, let us give our colleague Ram Charitrasa of the Center for Public Health and Environmental Development a few minutes to share his recent experiences from Nepal. For your information, Ram has been communicating with his government's designated national authority for the Rotterdam Convention, even before he heard that the IPEN lead paint elimination team was initiating a parallel effort. Let's hear from Ram, the gentle tiger of the Himalayas.
Okay, so thank you. I'm sharing a lead paint global phase out through elimination of its source, major source leaded pigment, experience from Nepal, and here I represent Chavez. He's a PO of IPEN and also Secretariat for NRO. Few facts about the issue and in Nepal with respect to Rotterdam Convention. Nepal is party like many of you or your country. In terms of industrial chemicals related to RC, we are facing serious problem with the industrial chemicals. Importation, as there is lack of basic industrial chemical regulation system in place. And we are very much lagging behind submission of import response to RC Convention, especially for the industrial chemicals. Having said that, in the recent ongoing, just the last yesterday finished the RC Convention training with the collaboration of government of Nepal from the Secretariat. We have unanimously agreed to initiate the process for nomination of lead pigments, including lead chromate, to be listed in RC as the lead paint, exerting severe public health and economic consequence on Nepalese government and public. For example, over 65% of children, Nepalese children, have elevated level of lead, more than 5 microgram per deciliter. And this is coming from government of Nepal research institution, resulting $1.5 billion annual loss, which is equivalent 4% of our GDP. And this is coming from environmental health perspective study back in 2013. And we have clearly seen over the year availability and use of leaded pigment is directly hindering to achieve 100% of compliance of lead paint standard. And this year, just a few days ago, on 24th October, we released our compliance monitoring report that only we found that 52% of the compliance, even after 6 years of passing of our Gazette notification of lead regulation, became effective. And lead pigment are not produced in Nepal. And this is the study report we released on the occasion of kicking off ILPPW 2021. And our standard became effective in 2015 June, and over the year, like 30, 43, and 52% only compliance, even after 6 years. So as of now, we can interpret it every second enamel paint we purchase is most likely to have lead concentration above our regulatory limit. And looking at this perspective, one of the major recommendations in these reports, new reports we made, is banning of leaded pigment in this report, so that we can increase or enhance or accelerate the compliance status. And this is what the good news I want to share. A good initiative has been taken by RC Secretariats and Government of Nepal, who jointly organized the training of how we can increase the effectiveness of the RC Convention in Nepal. Just accomplished just 2-3 days, and developing RC national implementation plan and process of proposed listing of leaded pigment in RS, and leaded pigment including lead chromate to be notified to the Secretariat for possible inclusion under RCPIC. So we have all participants of these recent events. We have agreed to initiate the process of nomination of leaded pigment to be listed in. So finally, what IPEN together and CFED as a sponsoring partner of today's webinar, I have just noted out 3 take-home messages, and I urge all of you participants, all of the government, all of the stakeholders can take this message home and think about this. So first, RC listing of lead pigments can help many developing countries like Nepal in enforcing the lead paint regulation more effectively and able to eliminate major source of exposure to the public health. Listing of lead pigment in RC 3 annex will help each country to clean the source of lead paints, since we cannot just work from the downstream. Upstream has to be cleaned, and that is the stopping availability and use of leaded pigments. And one best way is to list it in the RCP list. And as Jack sir has already committed, I once again reiterate, IPEN with its global network and long experience, robust technical intellectual capacity on lead paint elimination, wish to continue work with all the RC parties countries and augment in their efforts required to nominate, not only nominate, but also support the nomination of the leaded pigment to be listed in PIC. So, and these are the few pictures of our ILPPW 2021, where the last picture, one of our DNA for RC convention, he was explaining to clean up the source of lead in pigment, and one way he committed to take this initiative forward towards working for listing of leaded pigment in RC pick list. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ram, for these very encouraging news out of Nepal, and congratulations for your great work there.
Thank you.
We are now going to move over to a more general Q&A session. So that means that I will direct questions to all the panelists, and you will keep typing it in on the Q&A. So you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you see Q&A, and you type your questions, and I will hand them out as I see fit. And I would also like to encourage all the panelists to try to speak slowly. We have excellent, very hardworking interpreters here that needs to be able to follow what you say and translate in real time. So just a reminder about that as well. First of all, I have a follow-up question for Jack about the Annex 3 listing under Rotterdam Convention. Could you please again summarize in just a few points what that means? What is an Annex 3 listing? And what does that mean for countries? There are already countries that have adopted binding regulations. So why would this listing help them?
An Annex 3 listing means that the chemical that's listed is subject to prior informed consent. That is, a country cannot export that chemical to that country unless if that country does not want to receive it. A country, once the chemical is listed, the country has options to say, we're willing to accept it under all conditions, we're willing to accept it under no conditions, or as the case with lead chromates, there are certain conditions that we're willing to accept it, and there are certain conditions that we're not willing to accept it. And that means, for example, that we're not willing to accept lead chromates as pure ingredients for use in the manufacture of paints, and we're not willing to accept lead chromates when they're contained in mixtures, paints that are being imported to our country. Now, if you already have a regulation, and if it's already being well enforced, then it doesn't really mean much for you. But many countries that have regulations are having difficulty with enforcement. And with the Rotterdam listing, that would mean, on the one hand, that that country could say, we do not consent to imports of the lead pigments for use in the manufacture of paints, all paints or some paints. And we do not consent to the import of lead pigments when they are contained in mixtures when they're contained in paints, again, all paints or some paints, and this will put the responsibility for enforcing national regulatory controls in the first instance on the exporting countries, in the second instance on your national customs officials, and therefore the burden on your national environmental health regulatory officials will be much smaller. So that would be the case for countries that already have regulations. But I think the most exciting opportunity is for those countries who do not yet have regulations. The fact that your government will be required, if your government is almost certainly a party to the convention, it is expected within 9 months to respond to the listing. A government therefore has to address the question, do we or do we not want to deal with the question of lead in paint? So the government does have the option to say lead paint is okay. And we're willing to accept all the lead pigments for all the uses, and we're willing to accept all the lead paints you can send us. My expectation is many of the governments that have not been willing or ready to take the trouble for adopting a regulation will also not be willing or able to decide that lead paints are okay. And so this forces them to make a decision. Once, and high-level officials have so many things on their plates, it's very hard for them to even think about lead paints and lead pigments and that sort of thing. But once they have to make a decision, I think that will be a way of starting a process within your country to actually decide, do we or do we not want to control lead paints? And the good news is if the government decides it wants to control lead paints, their response to the Rotterdam listing to say, no, we don't want to accept imports, comes with some obligations. If you can't accept the import of something, then you can't domestically manufacture it as well. And so a government that denies import consent to some or all lead paints and to lead pigments for some or all uses, then cannot produce lead pigments for those uses and cannot produce the paints whose imports it denies consent to. And in many countries, the decision-making procedure to meet your obligations under an international treaty can be much faster than the decision-making procedure just to adopt a new regulation. And so in many countries, we think the adoption of the Rotterdam listing will then speed up the process by which countries consider the issue and the process by which they adopt lead paint controls. I hope that helps clarify it. I know this is a lot of new information.
Thank you very much, Jack. We received a question in the chat about lead acid batteries and how to eliminate those. This is a little bit outside the scope of the presentation today, but it's highly relevant for another convention, and that's the Basel Convention, which also operates on prior informed consent for shipping of waste. So this is a topic that IPEN is looking into and have started doing a little bit of work on, but hasn't. Our work on that is so far quite limited. So I will just suggest to keep an eye open because there will be more work within IPEN on this issue as well. So I want to recognize that question and thank you for that, and say more is to come. And I do believe we still have a few minutes. I know it's very late for some colleagues in Asia, but we started a bit late. So I think we can take a few more minutes for questions. And I have a question for Jeiel. It is about reformulation of paint, because that relates to the Rotterdam Convention, the accessibility of lead pigments and so on. And at the moment, there are a few countries where there are pilot projects where small and medium-sized enterprises are being supported with technical information to reformulate paint. How is IPEN gonna, and that will support them not needing lead pigments anymore, and in relation to that, not listing under the Rotterdam Convention will be supported. So is this something that IPEN intends to work more on, and how do IPEN intend to showcase those examples?
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the question, Leslie. As IPEN conduct more research studies on lead content in paint, we also share the results of our studies, our reports, to the relevant manufacturers of these paints. And usually in these communications, in these dialogues, we get to know the understanding from a perspective of the industry. What factors are they considering? What actions they need to undertake to eliminate lead in paint in their formulation. And when they say they want to reformulate their paints, then we can step in and link them to appropriate suppliers of raw materials so that these suppliers can share with them the technology that is available in these countries. And in the ongoing Jeff Sychem project, usually we invite paint industry associations and their member SMEs to participate in pilot demonstrations. And we also have partnered with several suppliers of raw materials. And in this project, we were able to know the problems that most SMEs face. For example, they face limited resources. They also face limited technical capacity. They also face limited laboratory capacity to undertake this testing on their own. So these suppliers have the laboratories and the technical capacities and technical information that they can share with the SMEs and paint manufacturers. And hopefully with limited funding, we're able to connect the SMEs that want to reformulate to the available suppliers in each country. So I think that's the overview of how we work in these reformulation efforts. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Jeiel. We don't have any more questions, and we are a bit over time. So I think it is time for me to thank everyone who participated. And just to recap this past 1.5 hours, if that is possible, we have heard today from Jeiel an overview about the IPEN campaign to eliminate lead paint, its history, its successes, its challenges. And we have also heard from both Sofia from Mexico and Ram from Nepal about the practical efforts on the ground to eliminate lead paint, and both the successes but also challenges that countries are facing. And all of this is setting the stage for why IPEN thinks it's a necessary and very important effort to list lead pigments and other lead compounds that are used in paint under the Rotterdam Convention. Because we see that countries clearly need help, even if they have put regulations in place to eliminate lead paint. If you don't have huge amount of resources or infrastructure, it is very difficult to control lead pigments coming into your country. So a Rotterdam Convention listing would help with that. And we are excited also to officially announce this effort today and continue to working with all of you and everyone who is interested in engaging in this effort. So you have seen emails in the presentations to the IPEN team, but we will also send out a follow-up email after the webinar to all of you that you can respond to, and we will set up a follow-up meeting where we will discuss more practical next steps that we can take together and to see how we can strategize around this and support countries to send in these notifications that Jack talked about. And before I officially announce the closing of the webinar, I want to send a really warm thank you to all our interpreters who've been working very, very hard and very professionally, and say how much we all appreciate your work. I also want to thank the organizing team of the webinar, who has also been working very hard to get everything in order and running this webinar together with us. And of course, I want to again thank you, all of you, friends, new and old, from all parts of the world, for joining this webinar. I'm very happy and excited to see your names, even though I have not seen a lot of faces today, but hopefully we'll see each other face to face. Take care, everyone, stay safe, and we will be in touch soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, everyone.